Jerusalem, without question, the most sacred city on earth. With a history spanning nearly 5,000 years, it has stood at the crossroads of three of the world's major religions. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all lay claim to this ancient and hallowed ground. It is little wonder, then, that Jerusalem has become one of the most contested cities in history, fought over by empires, kingdoms, and religious movements alike. Over the centuries, it has changed hands more than 40 times, with each era leaving deep scars that are still felt today. Early beginnings. The earliest traces of Jerusalem date back to around 3000 BCE. Its founders settled near the Gin Spring, a vital water source that allowed them to cultivate an otherwise dry and barren landscape. This small outpost would eventually become one of the most important cities in human history. By 2000 BCE, Jerusalem lay just outside the frontiers of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. It's during this period that the city was first mentioned in writing, referred to as Jerusalem in Egyptian texts. At the time, it was inhabited by the Canaanites, who built a massive stone wall around the settlement to protect their precious water. By 1500 BCE, Jerusalem had become a vassal state of the powerful Egyptian New Kingdom, whose territory extended from the Sahara to the borders of modern-day Turkey. Shifting powers. The Egyptian grip began to loosen in the 12th century BCE during a period known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, an age of turmoil that brought down many of the great powers in the eastern Mediterranean. In their place rose smaller, independent kingdoms. One such group was the Israelites, a branch of the Canaanites who, according to biblical tradition, were led by King David. Around 1000 BCE, David captured Jerusalem and made it the capital of his new kingdom of Israel. His son, King Solomon, later built a grand temple, known as the Temple of Solomon, solidifying the city as a spiritual and cultural hub of what would become the Jewish faith. Jerusalem under siege. For the next 4 centuries, Jerusalem flourished as the heart of Jewish faith and tradition, though it was constantly under threat from larger neighboring powers, especially the Egyptians and Assyrians, both competing for control of the region. Then came one of the most pivotal chapters in its history. In the 6th century BCE, the Babylonians rose to power under King Nebuchadnezzar II. Seeking to expand his empire, he besieged and captured Jerusalem in 597 BCE. Resistance from the local Jewish population led to a revolt a decade later. Jerusalem has changed hands many times throughout history. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the city during his campaign against the Persian Empire. However, Alexander's reign was short-lived, and after his death in 323 BC, his vast empire was divided among his generals. Jerusalem initially fell under the control of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, but after centuries of near-constant warfare, it came under the rule of the Seleucid Empire in 198 BC. During the reigns of Alexander and the subsequent Hellenistic rulers, many Jews in Jerusalem adopted Greek culture. This cultural shift sparked unrest, eventually erupting into the Maccabean Revolt during the 160s BC. In 164 BC, the Maccabees captured Jerusalem and restored Jewish worship at the Temple, an event commemorated by the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. After the revolt, Jerusalem became the capital of a semi-autonomous region and later the center of the independent Hasmonean kingdom, which lasted over a century. However, in 37 BC, Herod the Great seized the city and ruled as a client king under the expanding Roman Republic. Within a few decades, Jerusalem was fully absorbed into the Roman province of Judea. The city's religious significance also led to conflict. The Roman authorities viewed both Judaism and Christianity as threats. In 66 CE, the Jewish population revolted, leading to the First Jewish-Roman War. In 70 CE, after a 5-month siege, the Romans reconquered Jerusalem and destroyed much of it, including the Second Temple. Only the Western Wall, a sacred site for Jews, survived. The Romans rebuilt the city as Aelia Capitolina, banning Jews from entering except on specific holy days. Another Jewish revolt in 132 CE was brutally suppressed by Emperor Hadrian, who further Romanized the city, building a forum and a temple to Jupiter on the former site of the Jewish temple. Under Roman rule, Jerusalem became predominantly Christian. Emperor Constantine the Great, a Christian convert, sent his mother Helena to identify Christian holy sites. She found the location of Jesus' crucifixion and burial, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built in 335 CE, becoming a major Christian site. Under Muslim rule, Jerusalem flourished as a center of religious tolerance. Christians and Jews were allowed to worship freely. The Umayyad dynasty, ruling in the late 7th and early 8th centuries, constructed two of Islam's most sacred sites in Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, solidifying the city's importance in Islam. However, by the late 10th century, religious tolerance began to wane. In 969, the Fatimid Caliphate captured Jerusalem. Initially, Christians and Jews were still allowed to visit, but over time, persecution increased. This shift set the stage for future conflicts in the city. Thus, throughout centuries of conquest and religious transformation, Jerusalem evolved into a sacred city for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, each leaving a lasting legacy on its identity. Following the Christian belief that their sacred sites in Jerusalem were being desecrated, tensions escalated. These religious disputes were further intensified by the Great Schism of 1054, which marked the formal split between the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Greek Orthodox Church in the East. While rooted in long-standing theological, political, and cultural disagreements, the schism also underscored the struggle for supremacy within Christendom. After the schism, Jerusalem fell under the control of the Greek Orthodox Church, based in Constantinople, an act that deeply angered the papacy in Rome. By the late 11th century, the Fatimid Caliphate, which had long ruled Jerusalem, began to suffer from internal instability and growing external threats. In 1073, the Seljuk Turks seized control of Jerusalem after sweeping into the Middle East from Central Asia. Their rule brought political and social upheaval across the region, including increased harassment of Christian pilgrims trying to reach holy sites. The Seljuk expansion alarmed the Byzantine Empire, prompting Emperor Alexios I Komnenos to request military assistance from the Christian West. In 1095, this plea reached Pope Urban II, who transformed it into a rallying cry at the Council of Clermont, calling for a holy crusade to reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom. Driven by religious zeal and the promise of spiritual salvation, thousands of European knights and commoners began the arduous journey, spanning nearly 2,000 miles to the Holy Land. Although the Fatimids managed to briefly reclaim Jerusalem from the Seljuks in 1098, the First Crusade reached the city's gates just a year later. In June 1099, the Crusaders laid siege to Jerusalem, breaching its walls after several weeks. On July 15th, they entered the city and unleashed a brutal massacre, nearly exterminating its Muslim and Jewish populations. Under Saladin's rule, many Christian structures were either destroyed or transformed into Islamic institutions. However, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was spared and entrusted to the Greek Orthodox Church. The fall of Jerusalem back into Muslim hands sparked outrage in Europe and led to the launch of the Third Crusade in 1190. Led by King Richard the Lionheart of England and King Philip II of France, the campaign succeeded in regaining significant portions of the Crusader states' territories, though Jerusalem itself remained under Muslim control. European nations continued launching successive crusades in hopes of reclaiming Jerusalem for Christendom. Though Crusaders briefly regained control between 1229 and 1244, their efforts ultimately failed. In 1291, the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land fell, marking the end of Crusader rule. Jerusalem then came under the control of the Islamic Mamluk Sultanate. Despite diminished Christian and Jewish populations, the city remained a destination for pilgrims of all faiths. After nearly 300 years of Mamluk rule, the Ottoman Empire took control in 1516. Under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the city's walls were rebuilt, ushering in an era of relative religious tolerance. Synagogues, churches, and mosques coexisted peacefully. Ottoman rule was largely uneventful, and over time, Jerusalem experienced decline and stagnation. By the 18th century, the city had lost much of its importance. In the 19th century, Jerusalem had a population of only about 8,000 people, comprising Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Armenians. They lived in quarters associated with their faiths. Muslims near the Temple Mount, Christians near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Jews near the Western Wall, and Armenians around Zion Gate. As the Ottoman Empire weakened, European powers sought influence in the region. They built churches, consulates, and institutions in Jerusalem. European Jews also began returning to the city, escaping persecution and seeking spiritual connection to their ancestral homeland. By the 1860s, the old city's single square kilometer was overcrowded. New construction began beyond its walls. One of the first major developments was the Russian compound, featuring an Orthodox church, a consulate, and accommodations for pilgrims. Jewish philanthropists like Sir Moses Montefiore and Judah Turo supported Jewish settlement and state-building efforts. By 1882, roughly 25,000 Jewish immigrants had arrived, shifting the city's religious demographics. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I changed Jerusalem's fate once again. In 1917, British forces captured the city and imposed military rule for 3 years. Over the next 25 years, Jerusalem's population grew from 52,000 to over 165,000. About one-third were Arabs, mainly Muslims, and two-thirds were Jews arriving from across the diaspora. Tensions between Arabs and Jews escalated, leading to riots during the 1920s and further unrest in the 1930s and 1940s. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to partition Mandatory Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. To prevent religious tensions, Jerusalem was to be placed under international control. Yet, the plan failed. Civil war broke out, and Jerusalem became a battleground. After the British withdrawal in 1948, Israel declared independence, prompting a regional conflict known as the Arab-Israeli War. After 9 months of fighting, the former British Mandate and the city of Jerusalem were divided. West Jerusalem became part of Israel, while East Jerusalem, including the Old City, was controlled by Jordan. This division deepened the conflict between Arabs and Jews, setting the stage for further strife throughout the 20th century.